All right, welcome to Issues class. We'll get started in a couple minutes, a little bit early. People always kind of wander in coming up, but for those watching online, glad you're watching or watching later, because I know we don't have our normal kids Sunday school classes, so some people may be at home today with kids watching. Glad you're watching. Make sure you grab one of the handouts on the music stand. So today we're talking about American Midnight, the forgotten story of American democracy in crisis. So we're also going to have a book discussion group Tuesday night at 6 o'clock, either in room 2 of the Hammond Library. I forgot what one we advertised. But that'll be a chance for you to kind of share your reflections, either from reading the book if you read it, or if anything we talked today. Today's class will basically be the hour-long Cliff Notes version of the long book, kind of going into some different key things, parallels to today, all of that. So, and at the end, if you stay with me now, I talked about this book with Lonnie Bunch, who's the secretary of the Smithsonian Institute. He's also the one that kind of founded the African American History Museum, kind of asking him, his thoughts on this time period and moving out of that, how does it compare to other time periods or today. I will give you his response at the end of the class. So that's my teaser to hold you for the class. So, in American Midnight, the Great War of Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis, Adam Hochschild tells the story of one of the most repressive and violent periods in American domestic history from 1917 to 1921. So while the United States marched under the banner of freedom to enter World War I, at home the government was waging a relentless campaign against dissent, civil liberties, immigrants, labor unions, and leftist political movements. So the book highlights the paradox of post-World War I America. Despite the national euphoria over the military victory, the country was deeply divided. We often don't think about that time as being this deeply divided time, but it really was. The war, which had claimed the lives of more than 100,000 American soldiers, also left scars on the American psyche. As veterans returned home, they were met with indifference and in many cases hostility. The government under Wilson had promised them post-war prosperity, but instead they faced a nation rife with labor strikes, racial tensions, and a growing fear of a socialist revolution. So this period of resistance and repression in post-wartime America offers a sobering reminder that even a nation that prides itself on democratic values, freedom is not guaranteed, and is often most vulnerable in moments of national crisis. And you will see that around the world. If you want to stick around for timely topics after church today, we're talking about strongman leaders. How these are elected politicians who often get elected because of different issues in the country or crises, and while they're elected, they actually end up undermining and eroding democracy. Whether it's Duterte or Orban or Putin, we'll look at some of those examples. You could even potentially say, some people make the claim that Wilson was a strongman leader. I'd say he might have some tendencies, but because ultimately he maintained democracy after him, you couldn't completely be put in that box. But there are some definite aspects of strongman leadership as part of Wilson's presidency. So let me give you the backdrop. 1917 to 1921, a nation at the crossroads. So by 1917, the United States was undergoing a seismic transformation. This is all around the world too. Industrialization had reshaped the economy, immigration was at its peak for the time, and progressivism had brought about regulatory reforms. Often you'll see two strong men often come into power after there's been a somewhat progressive revolution, whether that's on women's rights, immigrant rights, new religious freedoms, or regulatory things. You'll remember at this time, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle was published in, I think, 1906. And you had those reforms around kind of FDA and food stuff. So you're getting all these new reforms that lead to some different social change. But these shifts also bred fear among elites and native-born Americans, fear of radical ideas, of foreign-born laborers, and of the growing power of organized labor. So when the U.S. entered World War I under Wilson, it marked not only a foreign engagement, but the beginning of an inroad spiral into authoritarianism. Wilson's rhetoric of making the world safe for democracy clashed brutally with the state's actions at home. So often people kind of speak out of both sides of their mouth. So the period is marked by intense xenophobia, white supremacy, and class anxiety. These undercurrents had always existed in American society, but they were inflamed by wartime fervor. The state, the press, and ordinary citizens became complicit in enforcing an ideological conformity that criminalized dissent and rewarded violence. So you had these periods throughout history, here in the United States, around the world, where it spikes, sometimes it normalizes, sometimes it doesn't, but a lot of these things that some people say are happening today happened first 1917, 1921. So let's talk about the speech that kind of kicked this off. So Hochschild says it kind of started April 2nd, 1917. By then, Europe had already been engulfed in World War I for about 3 years, with millions dead. The United States had not yet entered the war, though it had profited by selling arms to Britain and France. So we were profiting from the war. Wilson, an Anglophile with both idealistic and practical motives, believed the U.S. needed to join the conflict. Without participation, America would have little say in kind of reshaping the post-war world. Additionally, many Americans had invested in Allied war bonds, especially British, French, and Russian, and would lose their money if the Allies lost. Of course, those who held bonds in Tsarist Russia, in fact, never recovered their investments. Driven by this mix of moral ambition and economic interest, Wilson called for a joint session of Congress on April 2nd. A new Congress had recently convened, and anticipation was high. For the first time in memory, foreign diplomats in formal dress crowded the House chamber. Supreme Court justices, members of Wilson's family, other notable guests, including then Assistant Secretary of the Navy Franklin Roosevelt, filled the galleries. People thought maybe Wilson might call for limited military action, but when he asked for full conscription and a large army to be sent to Europe, the chamber erupted in joy. Chief Justice Edward White, a former Confederate soldier, led the standing ovation with tears of joy. So why would someone so conservative and not aligned with Wilson's politics celebrate such a costly war? Part of the answer lies in the emotional force that war can generate. The First World War, despite its devastating consequences, was seen by many as a noble cause and a chance for the U.S. to join a grand global crusade. It's often typical of war, right? The Crusades, go fight for the Holy Land. Whatever it is, we try to make war this noble, grand adventure that convince people, hey, sign up for this, it's going to be great. In reality, World War I wasn't much of a noble thing. It was a giant waste of a lot of lives. It was kind of a pointless war from the beginning. That's a whole other class, but it's not like some of these other wars where nations are trying to completely expand, take over things, World War II. So World War I was still seen, though, as this grand adventure. The United States is still a relatively new country in the grand scheme of things, right? We hadn't had a global war. We had the War of 1812. That doesn't count. Not a global thing. They wanted to kind of hey, we're starting to get big and strong. Let's go out there and show the world we're a player on this grand stage. Go Team USA! So they had this kind of fervor rising about joining a war. It was exciting for them. They'd almost forgotten the cost of war. And they hadn't been in Europe where they were not excited about war by that point. A whole generation of youth were basically lost. They hadn't seen some of these just battles of being in trench warfare and no man's land, just littered with bodies and mustard gas. Sometimes we forget the pain of things. We talked about it on last Tuesday with vaccines. I think, Steve, you were talking about often the new doctors you work with had never seen really the major effects of a lot of these diseases that have been, in most part, kind of put down, eradicated by vaccines, so you kind of don't feel they're a threat anymore. When you haven't been around war as much, you think, oh, nothing can go wrong, we're going to go have this glorious day. The Civil War, people thought, we're going to go out, have a picnic, see this battle, it's going to be one battle, it's going to be over, we'll be home for Christmas, we're going to wave banners, it's going to be great fun. Several years later, it was no longer great fun. So you had this excitement around World War I. So in the wake of Wilson's speech, a wave of hyper-patriotism swept the country, eagerly embraced by both government and business. They both saw it be good for their long-term aims. So now we'll talk about the architecture of repression, laws, institutions, and violence. So the labor movement first. So why was hyper-patriotism useful to both the government and big business during World War I? Well, because it provided a convenient excuse to suppress the growing labor movement. For years, labor and business had clashed, with strikes often turning deadly. Over 70 workers were killed in a single strike in 1913 to 1914. So now is the big question is, which is more dangerous for democracy, for normal people, big government or big business? And often conservative liberals will say one or the other. Often the worst is when they get together looking how their aims can coincide. That's what often becomes problematic for both democracy and kind of the average person. Not just in the US, but around the world, when government and big business really kind of get in bed together, bad things happen. Other bad things happen when the government and religion get in bed together. Never in the history of the world has religion and government ended up doing good things together. Keep that in mind always. We'll talk about that more this summer as we talk about the confessing church, Nazi Germany, and all that. So once the U.S. entered the war in April of 1917, any striking worker could be accused of sabotaging the war effort because you're not helping churn out bombs and other things we need. So a stark example came just a month later in Bisbee, Arizona, where striking copper miners were forcibly removed from their homes at gunpoint by a sheriff's posse. Over 1,000 miners who refused to return to work were detained under the hot sun, loaded into manure-filled cattle cars, and shipped 180 miles through the desert to an army stockade, all in the name of national security. So when war comes, you're often given more powers, and people are more lenient to losing some of their liberties in the efforts of victory. That same summer, another miners' strike erupted in Butte, Montana, following the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in the U.S. history, where more than 160 men were killed in an underground fire. So Hochschild also details how the IWW, known as the Wobblies, a radical labor union known for its militancy and opposition to World War I, was targeted by the government. The Wobblies' anti-war stance led to a brutal crackdown. Leaders of the Wobblies, such as Big Bill Haywood, were arrested, and the union was effectively destroyed through government interventions. The government basically destroyed this union. The wartime government viewed the Wobblies as a serious threat to national security, associating labor unrest with Bolshevism. Anti-American, to not just want to lean fully into this Protestant work ethic capitalism where you are what you produce. The crackdown on labor unions during this period set a precedent for future efforts to suppress working class movements and dissent. A Wobbly organizer named Frank Little went to Butte to try to organize the miners so that they wouldn't have actions like this in the future. Again, a small community, 180 people died in this, 160 men were killed in this accident, so trying to kind of build safer standards for work. So he goes there. In the middle of the night, a group of masked men came into the boarding house where he was staying, took him out of his bed in his underwear, tied a rope around him, dragged him behind a car to a railroad bridge on the outside of town, and hanged him. America, not just racial lynchings, but basically government-sponsored lynchings of people they thought were dissenting or, for Frank Little's mind, trying to protect workers. Oh no, what if other people think this too? It's going to be harder for big business to succeed, harder for the war effort. We can kill him. His name was Frank Little, and Vice President Thomas Marshall quipped that a little hanging goes a long way in suppressing labor unrest. Now I can hear that being said today by politicians. They'll be like, oh, they didn't really mean it like that. Here's the reality. He was the vice president and said this. So it's a reminder that cruel and cynical things being said by leaders of this country is nothing new. This is another instance of how this war hysteria was used to carry on domestic battles here. The National Guard occupied Butte for the remainder of the war, and no further strikes occurred. So again, government using National Guard to go into places where they think dissent is. And they're trying to not have another accident happen where 160 people are killed, and they maintain law and order. Again, nothing new under the sun. 2 years later, in the summer of 1919, tensions exploded across the country. Cities like Omaha, Nebraska, and Gary, Indiana were placed under martial law due to widespread labor unrest and brutal racial violence. That year saw some of the worst racial riots in U.S. history. Hochschild argues that they should be called white riots instead of race riots because most of them were instigated by white mobs angered by the Great Migration, which brought large numbers of black Americans northward to escape the oppressive conditions in the South, where lynchings occurred at a rate of 1 per week. So they're trying to get out of there, but then the northern people didn't like it. So often northerners like to think, we're so righteous and great. We didn't have all these lynchings and things. The South is bad. The northerners were just as racist and just as bad. They like to whitewash their history and think they're better than Great on the Curve, better than this group of people. But they also did a whole lot of bad things. A lot of lynchings happened in the North, but also these kind of major riots, burning out homes, destroying whole neighborhoods when the black people moved into their cities. So the North does not get a pass on its racial history by any stretch of the imagination. So by 1919, the war had ended, and 4 million U.S. soldiers were being demobilized, about 400,000 of them black. With wartime factories shut down, these veterans were thrust into a collapsing job market, increasing the tensions between white and black workers. What had been pre-existing labor and racial conflicts were now intensified by war hysteria and economic collapse. So now we're talking about the intersecting forces of racism, xenophobia, and anti-communism. So another significant aspect of Hochschild's book is exploration of how the fear of radicalism intersected with deeply entrenched radical and ethnic prejudices in America. The Red Scare was not merely a fear of political ideologies, it was a radicalized xenophobic panic, one that particularly targeted immigrants. So again, kind of the distrust and putting all our fears and anxieties into one group, immigrants, also is not a new thing. So the immigrant backlash during the period is evident in the treatment of Italian and Jewish immigrants. Many Italian and Jewish immigrants were seen as radicals due to their involvement in labor movements and anarchist ideologies. This led to violent incidents such as the famous case of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, 2 Italian anarchists who were convicted of murder in 1921 despite significant doubts about their guilt. You also saw a rise of the Ku Klux Klan. They had been largely dormant since the Reconstruction era, but now we're kind of seeing a resurgence in the 20s, capitalizing on the racial and anti-immigrant sentiments of the time. They expanded their focus from African Americans to include Jews, Catholics, and immigrants. So not just in the South, all over the country. There's still large groups of them in Pennsylvania that are still decently active. So again, it's not a Southern problem. W.E.B. Du Bois, who noted that the U.S. government's crackdown on labor and political dissidents disproportionately targeted black activists, said the Ku Klux Klan, under the guise of patriotism, was allowed to murder, terrorize, and intimidate black Americans with almost complete impunity. One of the most powerful examples in the book is the story of the 1919 race riots, including the notorious Red Summer, where white mobs attacked black communities across the country. Hochschild writes about the violence in cities like Chicago and Elaine, Arkansas, where racial tensions erupted into bloody confrontations. In Elaine, Arkansas, a black sharecropper strike in 1919 was brutally crushed. Over 200 black men, women, and children were murdered by white mobs and law enforcement. Chicago, Washington, D.C., and other cities saw violent racial clashes with dozens of black Americans lynched or killed in the race riots. The federal government's response to these events was tepid at best, and in many cases, law enforcement either ignored the violence or actively participated in the repression. One survivor from Elaine said, "We were hunted like animals. The violence was not random, but was encouraged by the radicalized political atmosphere, where black labor activists were often viewed as threats to both the social order and national security." In Georgia, a lynch mob killed 13 black people, among others a farm worker whose courageous wife, 8 months pregnant, made what a local paper called unwise remarks in protest. Hochschild described the response. The mob strung her up a tree by her ankles, doused her with gasoline, and set her on fire. As she screamed in pain, a member of the mob knifed open her belly, and when her unborn child fell to the ground and gave a cry, men stomped it to death. The mob included the foreman of the county's grand jury. No one was ever prosecuted. Bad things happen in the U.S. We can't whitewash our history and say, we're this great democracy sitting on the hill, we are the shining beacon. It's not true. We can lean into it, we can try to be where we want to go, but you can't get to where you want to go without an honest assessment of who you are, where you're at, and your past. You can't have a better future without being real about your past. So try to hide these issues, say, well, it's depressing, or we want to focus on the negative. Sometimes you have to focus on the negative to be able to get to the positive. Now, you don't only talk about the negative history. You need to talk about the good things as well, the things where America has done great, the people who stood up and fought for justice and equality and democracy, and we're going to talk about those people too. You have to have both and. So racial divisions were not just a backdrop to the larger political struggles of the time, but a central feature that shaped reactions to the wartime crisis and post-war fears. Racism, both institutionalized and vigilante-driven, was deeply embedded in the response of the government and of the broader challenges to American democracy during this kind of midnight period of U.S. history. So Wilson himself was a proud white supremacist and a staunch Southerner. Born in Virginia, raised in Georgia, he grew up in a deeply segregationist environment. As a boy, he and his family, disturbed by the sight, watched Confederate President Jefferson Davis being marched through Augusta, Georgia by Union troops on his way to prison. So let's not pretend Wilson wasn't a white supremacist. We can try to kind of make that all seem better, find a couple quotes here and there, but let's be real, he was. Just like Strom Thurmond, he was. Own it. So Wilson's father was a Presbyterian minister, and he preached a pro-slavery interpretation of the Bible. Wilson himself was a respected historian and president of Princeton University, having authored over a dozen books, though his writings often portrayed slavery in a disturbingly benign light. He felt most at ease among white Southerners. His two wives, closest advisors, including Edward House and his doctor, and about half his cabinet were all conservative white Southerners. When Wilson took office in 1913, he reversed the limited racial integration that had occurred in the federal government. During his presidency, the number of black federal employees declined. He openly believed that only white Anglo-Saxons were capable of self-government. All 10 members of his first cabinet were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. This is kind of like this Western civilization, this idea of saving Western civilization we talked about last week kind of comes up. This is the kind of idea that kind of brings up in people. This kind of Wilson, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, these are the people who are only capable of self-government. The Anglo-Saxon supremacy, though, is not unique to Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt, though no longer president in 1917, was another outspoken advocate. He was a colorful and opinionated figure. Roosevelt viewed Anglo-Saxon dominance as essential and believed women's role was to bear many children to strengthen the race. That's not all that different from the kind of Aryan race politics that we'll see in Nazi Germany later. Next week, we're going to talk about how American race law was the blueprint for the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany. It's not even just the laws itself, it's a lot of the attitudes towards race. These things with Teddy Roosevelt and others picked up before World War I, everything else that seeps into the world, and it's picked up by others and taken to other extremes. Roosevelt really wanted to lead a volunteer force to World War I. He was like 59, and Wilson was like, no, go back home, Teddy. And Teddy was mad. All right, so the Palmer raids and the first Red Scare. The fear of radicalism was perhaps the most defining characteristic of post-war America. It's like it's engendering fear of there are these radicals out there that want to destroy America. You know, the far left, communism, Red Scare, they're going to destroy everything. Now we throw Antifa out there. Antifa's not a real thing. It's not an official group. It's kind of a catch-all to throw people into a thing. But there's no like people having Antifa clubs anywhere, right? So there's this kind of building fears that, hey, this radical group's coming for you, and they want to steal your medicine and your jobs and your culture and ruin everything. Let's crack down, destroy them. Same thing happens in Germany as well. Hey, let's fear the far left. After the Reichstag fire, that we don't know who said it, it was, hey, these people are coming for us. Give me, Hitler, all the power to stomp them out, and I will protect you and keep you safe. Building fear always builds power for someone. Always look who's causing the fear, then look to the moves that they make to consolidate power. So, as labor movements grew, there was a backlash. Many think organized labor as a front for kindness activity. Sometimes maybe it was. Other times it was, we just want better lives and jobs and safeties for ourselves. But if you're a business owner, you don't want to pay living wages or have to spend a whole bunch of money making things safer. You can say, you're just communists. We don't have to listen to you. You can discount legitimate concerns by making them seem radical. So in 1920, Attorney General A. Mark Mitchell Palmer launched the infamous Palmer Raids, which targeted suspected radicals, many of them immigrants. Thousands of people were arrested, often without warrants, and many were deported, often without trials. Attorney General Palmer often described anarchists and communists, many of whom were immigrants, as alien agitators bent on destroying American civilization, a term that implicitly linked foreignness with racial otherness. So again, some of the things happening today that are rhetoric, pulling from the past. Because it worked then, why wouldn't it work today? This period marked the peak of government repression during the immediate post-war years, where the suppression of political dissent became almost normalized. The Palmer Raids demonstrated how fear of foreign influence and radical ideas could lead to mass violations of civil liberties. But when you're scared enough, and people have made you be really afraid, even though it may not actually be a real fear, you're fine with just kind of turning away and be like, it's probably fine. They're probably bad people. Let's not worry about the civil liberties thing. Which is why even in today with issues around deporting people, it's like in some cases, they may be really bad criminals. They probably should be deported. But making sure we follow the laws to do it. Because once you get rid of steps that are legal steps, to fast track these, hey, this is a good end, let's forget about the legal means. Now you can cut off other legal means to what anybody decides is a good end. So the power of propaganda and the repression of dissent. Propaganda is always very powerful. So the British were great at propaganda during World War I because they painted the Germans as these horrible people to hunt who were coming and eating Belgian babies and things. It's called atrocity propaganda. They're very good at it. Then the Nazis learned from the British, and they also did a very good job at atrocity propaganda. It's getting an emotional response out of people that's not rooted in logic or rationalism, because it's easier to appeal to instinctual fear or greed or anger than our rational minds. You can't really appeal to a rational mind in a picture meme on Facebook, but you can sure appeal to fear and greed and pride in that same amount of space. So this period of American history would be incomplete without mentioning George Creel and the fact the government created a propaganda machine that spread hate speech, sponsored by the government. Creel, a journalist and supporter of Wilson, was given a large budget to establish an agency dedicated to promoting the war effort. The agency used every possible medium at the time, films, books, pamphlets, posters, to portray the war as a noble cause. Understand, the government always tries to kind of show what they're doing is good. Democrat, Republican, you got the press secretary out there with slogans, things on the White House, web page, posters. They're always trying to show how what they're doing, whatever administration, is good for the country. That part, normal. But one of the most well-known initiatives was the 4-Minute Men, a group of speakers trained to deliver 4-minute speeches in various public settings. Kiwanis, Rotary clubs, church gatherings, all of that. The 4-Minute Men were especially famous for appearing in movie theaters. At the time, films were shown on reels that last about 20 minutes. Small movie houses with only one projector would pause between reels, typically showing advertisements for local businesses. During the war, they replaced these ads with slides announcing a government speaker who would give a brief patriotic talk about the war or urge citizens to support the effort. They even had 4-minute men who spoke different languages to address ethnic groups and colored speakers for black audiences. This relentless patriotism permeated American life, and the government censorship that began during the war continued for years afterwards. So under Postmaster General Albert Burleson, a conservative segregationist from Texas, white supremacist, press censorship was enforced on a large scale. Burleson had the authority to declare any publication unmailable, meaning it couldn't be sent through the mail. While mainstream newspapers were largely unaffected, many smaller journals and magazines were silenced. By the time Burleson left office, he had forced 75 publications out of business and banned specific issues of hundreds more. This censorship continued for over 2 years after the war ended. So government-sponsored censorship basically shutting down free press through legal loopholes. When we talk about strongmen and atomic topics, we'll see one of the main things is beginning to shut down a free press through any legal means possible. They did it by, oh, this is unmailable, can't send the mail, which effectively didn't have email back then, shut down those organizations. The period also marked a shift from anti-German sentiment to anti-communist hysteria. Early on, the government targeted all things German, language, culture, even music by Beethoven. This is when the Frankfurter got turned into the hot dog. Several states passed laws banning the speaking of German, and German books were burned in bonfires across the country. People get weird during the war. Germans couldn't find jobs, they were forced off the land they owned, they were victims of nationalistic violence. There's a difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism can be good, nationalism, always bad. Don't do it. If you're killing Germans who are your neighbors, but now because their last name is Gleckler or something, you want to kick them off the land and beat them up, that's not good. And this happened a lot throughout the country because now we were fighting Germany. Anybody with that German last name became just suspected, oh my gosh, they're secret agents or something like that. So as the Russian Revolution unfolded in 1917, suspicion now turned to communists and Bolsheviks. Anyone speaking a foreign language could be seen as a potential spy, whether German or Russian. After the war, the hysteria intensified, especially towards leftists, anarchists, and communists. Many Americans were in prison for speaking out against the war. Eugene Debs, a socialist who ran for president, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for an anti-war speech in 1918. He remained in prison for years after the war, and in the 1918 election, he received nearly 1 million votes despite being incarcerated in prison. We talk about other governments, like, oh, Turkey, you're so bad, you're imprisoning your political opponents. Russia, you're so bad, you're imprisoning your political opponents. Democracy, democracy. We've done it too. We are not this shiny democratic nation that doesn't do these things. When it suits those in power, they try to stay in power. The government also punished filmmakers. One example is a director who made a silent film, The Spirit of 76, poking fun of the British during the American Revolution. By the time the film was released in 1917, well, oops, now the British were our allies, so the filmmaker was sentenced to 3 years in prison for offending our ally, ruining his life over a harmless film that at the time was made was following the common tropes of how the American narrative around the revolution was going. So he made a film that people seem to have liked, but now they're our allies, you're going to jail. The government did this. What our country is seeing now is nothing new. Anti-immigrant rhetoric and action, press censorship, and political imprisonment. President Trump in his first term and his second has expressed a desire to close down dissenting media and imprison opponents. That's not me making, that's what stuff he said. So that's what he says, much like the actions of the Wilson administration. And before him, the Adams administration. These things were legal at the time, no one stopped those two. Why should it be any different? President Trump could easily say, this is a proud American tradition of doing this, I'm not doing anything new. And he wouldn't be wrong. Another figure from this time was General Leonard Wood, a close friend of Teddy Roosevelt. Wood, who had earned the Congressional Medal of Honor for his role in capturing the Native American leader Geronimo, had also fought during the Philippine War. In 1919, he was the leading Republican candidate for president. His platform included mass deportations of troublemakers, a stance shared by his potential Democratic rival, Palmer. the Attorney General. Both candidates advocated for deporting thousands of immigrants if they were elected. Ultimately, neither won their party's nomination in 1920. So again, people candidating on, we have a lot of immigrants, this is bad for the country, let's get them all out. Also, nothing new. This period of massive state repression and nationalism led the groundwork for similar fears and policies in future generations. The rhetoric we've seen over the last 10 years is not new, it is tried, it is true. So let's talk about some people that struggle for justice, on the activism and resistance side. So despite this overwhelming wave of repression, this period is not simply a tale of despair. Again, we should not only focus on the negative, focus on the positive. It's also a story of resistance. The worst in humanity often brings up the best too. It's important not to forget that. As Mr. Rogers would say, look for the helpers. Look for the resistors or the repairers of the breach, to put it biblically. While many Americans were cowed by fear, others resisted the tide of repression and fought for the ideals of freedom and justice. These activists helped lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement and the broader struggle for social justice that would shape the 20th century. So we'll start with Emma Goldman and Kate Richards O'Hare. So Emma Goldman, a longtime charismatic anarchist known for her wide-ranging interests, was passionate about modern literature and art, women's liberation, and was a fierce opponent of World War I from the very beginning. She spoke out boldly against the draft, which marked the first U.S. conscription since the Civil War. Goldman was quickly arrested, tried, and sentenced to 2 years in prison. At her trial, she delivered a remarkable speech telling the all-male jury, quote, "Who is the real patriot? Or rather, what is the kind of patriotism that we represent? The kind of patriotism we represent is the kind of patriotism which loves America with open eyes. Our relation towards America is the same as the relation of a man who loves a woman, who is enchanted by her beauty, yet who cannot be blind to her defects. And so I wish to state here on my own behalf, and in behalf of hundreds and thousands of whom you decry and say to be anti-patriotic, that we love America. We love her beauty, we love her riches, we love her mountains and her forests, and above all we love the people who have produced her wealth and riches, who have created all her beauty. We love the dreamers and the philosophers and the thinkers who are giving America liberty. But that must not make us blind to the social faults of America. That cannot make us deaf to the discords of America. That cannot compel us to be inarticulate to the terrible wrongs committed in the name of patriotism and the name of the country. We simply insist, regardless of all protest to the contrary, that this war is not a war for democracy. If it were a war for the purpose of making democracy safe for the world, we would say that democracy must first be safe for America before it can be safe for the world." Good speech. True then, true now. After serving her sentence, Goldman was deported and never allowed to return to the United States. Another resistor was Kate Richards O'Hare, a leading orator for the Socialist Party, who was also imprisoned for opposing the war. While in the women's penitentiary at Jefferson City, O'Hare ended up in the cell next to Goldman and they became close friends. They each wrote about the other, which is a gift to any historian, having two central figures who knew each other and left first-hand accounts. Another hero of this story is Dr. Marie Equi, a physician from Portland, Oregon, a vocal critic of the war and of censorship. She was also incredibly inventive. Whenever the police blocked her anti-war speeches downtown, she found a workaround. Using a telephone line with crampons, she climbed a utility pole and delivered her speech from the top as the crowd gathered below. Only when she climbed down was she arrested, and like the others, she too was sent to prison. So we talk about freedom of speech, but apparently, if you're against what the government or the nation seems like is the necessary patriotism at the time, you don't have that freedom, and you're arrested. So again, we often will criticize foreign nations about their repression and jailing of people who dissent to the government. We have a long and proud tradition of doing the same. And often other countries will clap back at us about it. To be fair to Putin, often what he says about America is true. And he says, "You're calling me about this," or China says, "You're calling me out about this. Look and get your own house in order before you start throwing stones here." Or to put it biblically, get the log out of your own eye before trying to get the speck out of another's eye. Both can be true. There can be civil rights things happening in Russia and China elsewhere, and here at the same time. We can't just look out there. We got to do both and. Lewis F. Post. Earlier we talked about Palmer and his sweeping plans to deport thousands of people from the United States. To make that happen, Palmer launched the Palmer Raids. Roughly 10,000 people were arrested in raids across more than 24 cities. They were interrogated, often violently, and thousands were jailed as potential candidates for deportation. This was Palmer Raids were early ICE, going into places, spotting people, rounding up, putting in prison, and be like, oh, actually you're fine. After 3 weeks of being horribly treated, you can go. Others, you're deported. Again, nothing new. At the time, if the government labeled you a troublemaker and the definition was intentionally broad, and if you weren't a U.S. citizen, you could just be deported. So that's the basis that the Trump administration uses today, too, of we can deport you, like the case of the student leading the protests at Columbia. You're a troublemaker, we're allowed to deport you. Look, we have precedent going back to the Wilson era. So a lot of these things that the Trump administration says, and people say, oh my gosh, you can't do that, they're arguing we can because other presidents have done it and it wasn't found to be illegal at the time. They might find it to be illegal now to the court, but they have precedent. They're not just pulling this stuff out of anywhere. They can look and say, this has happened before, it was allowed to happen before, why can't we do it now? And they have solid footing to stand on those cases because they do have legal and historical precedent, unless there are new laws posted that says they can't anymore. And even then, you can find legal loopholes. We talked about that a few weeks ago at Time and Topics about presidential power, that often you haven't defined everything yet. We deal with it in church often. Who has the power to do what? Until we decide ultimately, it's often a question. Somebody has to make those decisions. So now many of the people have lived in the U.S. for years, but they've never gone through the formal process of becoming naturalized citizens because they didn't think it was necessary at the time, too much red tape, whatever. Palmer had them locked up and was preparing to deport them by the shipload. He even gave a public speech boasting that ship after ship would sail out of New York Harbor, carrying these people away for good. But Palmer's plan hit an unexpected wall. A quiet but courageous bureaucrat named Lewis F. Post. Post was acting Secretary of Labor at the time. Before joining the Wilson administration, he had been a progressive journalist and civil liberties advocate. Now here's a twist. While Palmer's Justice Department conducted the raids, the authority to deport people actually fell under the Department of Labor because they controlled the Immigration Bureau. Post wasn't a radical, he wasn't a socialist or anarchist, but he firmly believed that no one should be deported simply for their political beliefs. Post reviewed the cases, threw out thousands of arrest warrants, and ordered the release of hundreds of detainees. In doing so, he effectively dismantled Palmer's deportation campaign. Palmer was, of course, furious, and so was the real behind-the-scenes architect of the raids, a 24-year-old named J. Edgar Hoover, who, of course, would go on to become a household name in American law enforcement. They tried everything to get rid of Post. They demanded his firing. They got the American Legion to call for his removal. Congress even threatened impeachment, but Post held firm. He stayed in office until the very last day of the Wilson administration. Does that sound familiar at all? People who said, I'm not leaving, even though you're making all different ways to get rid of me, I want to stay in my position. Whether that's Jerome Powell or other people, there's a lot of that. Post was the rare combination, a skilled strategic bureaucrat and a passionate defender of civil liberties. You can read La Follette at home on your own. We got only like 10 minutes left. So read about Robert La Follette at your own home. So, relevance to contemporary America, parallels and lessons. So the period following World War I was this American Midnight, a time of national darkness where democratic ideals were under siege. The book draws parallels between the political repression of the post-war era and the challenges facing America today, particularly in terms of the ongoing struggles for racial equality, labor rights, political dissent. We live in a time of significant political polarization, increased surveillance, and the erosion of civil liberties. And people on both sides would say each different side has participated in that. And they're probably right. There's been censorship, repression, surveillance, different things done by both political parties trying to maintain power and trying to increase polarization. Because the more polarized people are, the more different people can stay in power. So the lessons from this American Midnight are, first, the dangers of political repression. When societies allow fear and suspicion to justify the erosion of civil liberties, the very foundations of democracy are at risk. 2, the importance of vigilance. This period reminds us that the struggle to protect democratic values is never complete. The fight for justice and freedom requires ongoing activism, courage, and solidarity. We'll talk about that a lot more with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany and that need of being vigilant and solidarity. Because once the vigilance stopped, when people didn't stand together, you start picking people apart. Niemoller talked about it, and we'll talk a lot more about him, but first they came for the communists, then they came for the socialists, then they came for the Jews, and thankfully for me there was no one here because they weren't standing together. And last, the need for unity amid diversity. This chapter in our history should remind us of the importance of a truly inclusive democracy, one that can resist the forces of division and xenophobia that seek to pit one group against another. We often try to, especially nowadays, these influenced and political activists on both sides of the aisle, they are trying to further split people apart. People can say, oh, they did some good, or they made some things, they were Christian, or whatever. Both sides, they try to divide people, and that builds their power and their base, and it further splits people apart. And that's what's actively being tried. Let's get people split further apart, because then we can kind of more easily take out different segments, convert different segments. So we need to stand unified on the things that really matter to us. Because there's a lot we may disagree on. But statistics show there's a lot we actually agree on, and we don't stand together on those things. And so we let the things that we disagree on completely divide us, and then none of the things we agree on actually happen. I listened to a podcast with a guy named Benji Backer, who actually started Turning Point with Charlie Kirk, back when the whole point of Turning Point was to focus on the national debt. Eventually, Backer, his main focus was the environment. And he now has a thing called Nature is Not Partisan. We're trying to get people, conservative and liberal and everything else, to be like, hey, we all can want clean water and places to hunt and fish and hike and national parks to enjoy and safe land for farming. Why can't we gather around these issues and not make it so polarizing and work together to move these things forward? And that's what we don't see a lot of these days because people want the polarization. Politicians will lament it, but watch what they do. They drive it all the time. Another key lesson is you don't need to be a loud theatrical figure to be a demagogue and enforce impression. We didn't actually have the timely topics on hand already. We will sometime soon, but as in the story, sometimes you can just be a basic bureaucrat, and that's just doing some simple paper pushing, and that's where some of the truly awful things can happen. Woodrow Wilson, one of the most dignified and scholarly American presidents, oversaw the jailing of his opponents, press censorship, and showed little concern for the suppression of civil liberties. Democracy is valuable but fragile, and it can be threatened by unexpected sources. We must remain vigilant. You don't have to be some bombastic dictator-type person to do these things. No one would think that Wilson, oh, this big, bombastic, self-appointed person. But he had that kind of prideful, white supremacist Anglo-Saxon thing, but kind of hid it under this, I'm a nice, white, southerly, scholarly gentleman thing. And all these things happen under his watch. It can happen under anybody's watch. So I think we should give Hochschild the last word on the subject, though. He says, I think there is one thing that I want people to take away from American Midnight, is the idea that democracy, despite all the different checks and balances and separation of powers and whatnot written into our Constitution more than 200 years ago, is fragile. It can easily be shattered and broken. It can easily be threatened. We've been reminded that very recently by, for example, the assault on the Capitol January 6th of 2021. And in this period, 1970 to 1921, I really think a lot of the basic democratic freedoms that we take for granted in this country, we lost during that period. So ultimately, American Midnight compels us to reconsider our understanding of American history, to recognize the unfinished nature of its promises, and to learn from the forgotten crises that still echo today. So back to Lonnie Bunch. So I was in a meeting with the Secretary of the Smithsonian back in sometime, a few months ago, and he's the Secretary of the whole Smithsonian Institute. He started the African American History Museum there in D.C. We were talking, something brought up this idea, and I kind of asked the question of, I've been reading American Midnight, and in a lot of ways, you hear all these horrible things happening. It reminds us, these kind of things have happened, but democracy gets back on course. And it kind of brings me a little bit of hope and perspective on the larger scale of things. So I asked, what's your kind of feeling of this period and today? And he did not give me the words of hope I wanted. He said, today is more frightening than this period that we call American Midnight. Take that for what you want. He's a historian, has a lot of historical knowledge, perspective. He's saying this is a bad period. So keep alert, keep awake, follow these passages, understand the dangers of political repression, whether it's liberals putting aside conservatives, censoring them, or vice versa. Keep vigilant about things on all sides. Just because what happens now is when our side does it, we're like, well, they really needed to, though. When the other side does it, this is bad. Both sides practice some of these things, and we're quick to turn our eye when the people we ultimately align with do it. Because we think, well, in that case it's for justice, for that case it's for righteousness, for that case it's really for a good end. When the other side does it, it's they're breaking the law, this is bad. So stay vigilant and kind of step back from kind of your long-term motivation, see the bigger picture. And again, unity amid diversity. Stay in the room with difference. Remain friends with people you have different politics with, have different backgrounds from. Reach out to different races, religions, immigrants, form communities, because we're all separated in our own little bubbles of Presbyterians or people who work at the Hershey Company or at the hospital or whatever, and we don't have these broader coalitions, we don't have unity. It's one reason I started a faith leaders group in the area that has Catholics, Protestants, non-denominational, Muslims, Jews, everybody, to try to have this larger coalition of people that we can stand together, even though we have some major differences in our beliefs and everything else. We can stand in unity amid our diversity and support each other when we need to. Questions, comments, midnightish remarks? Molly.
Is there a reason that he concluded this period in 1921? Did something happen that some improvement, or did he just have to pick a hit day?
Let's ask him that. I think probably you start seeing this shift after 21. I forget, when was the presidential election? When did Wilson leave office? I forget.
1920, wasn't it?
Yeah, so probably like, okay, somebody else comes in and having to pick a date. Some of these things he kind of says go on beyond that, but there wasn't like one major kind of thing. It kind of started petering out as Wilson leaves office and you get new people in. Some of these like radicals who were running for office in 1920 ultimately ended up losing on both sides of the party nominations. You know, were really campaigning on anti-immigrant rhetoric and everything else. Other questions, comments? Yes, Marty, again.
Anywhere in the book does he talk about what kind of influence the international pandemic, the Spanish flu, had?
Not so much. A little bit of, anytime you have crisis that allows these things to come up, whether it's a manufactured crisis, which often happens around the world, or legitimate crisis. Those are always used to kind of consolidate power, right? So you have the fear of death from the Spanish flu, just like, you know, we had a COVID. You can put in new restrictions in place. They didn't do quite as much with that back then, so it wasn't such a key player, but it's part of that larger piece of fear and anxiety. We got the Spanish flu, we got the rise of labor unions, we got the war, we got more immigrants, so it all comes together to make a super fear. And when people are fearful, they often will want somebody to come in and promise to fix it. So Tiny Topics will talk more about how strongmen use those crises, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic, a fire in the Reichstag, an assassination, a false flag, terrorist event, any of those things, manufacture real crises often allow for repression and strongman leaders to take up. That's one of the lessons in on tyranny that we talked about a couple months ago. One of those 20 lessons for the 20th century is when you have these times of crises, that's when you have to watch out, because that's when people will use that. So this flu was kind of a larger piece of the big puzzle of fear. Bill, do you have your name?
Yeah, the bit on immigration has always bothered me. You're talking the 20s. They're what, second, third, fourth generation, and they're considered native born? I mean, we have that today. I mean, none of us have lived here all our, I mean, we have. I mean, our families have all been immigrants, no matter, regardless of where we are. They all came from somewhere else. I've never quite understood why we had this nationalism in that immigration is so bad. We were built on immigration.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that's a challenge around the world right now. This balance, I think nations trying to figure out of immigration, culture, holding capacity. Same thing with like wildlife, right? You get too many of one kind of wildlife in an area, you can actually have a trophic cascade, I think it's called. And so trying to find those balances, you could have too many immigrants in anything. You could have too many people in an area and have a cascade. So trying to have that balance, and then often picking who's the weakest link that we can turn against to kind of form unity around. Because if you're trying to drive fear, who's the easiest to pick on? That's schoolyard politics, right? If you want to get people together, who's the one we can all make fun of? Because like, I don't need to make fun of, I'm not one of the cool kids, but if I can make them make fun of Brussels sprouts over there, then all that's going to be there, I can join up with them against that person. They're the easier target often, because you can more easily stoke fears of, they're not really one of us, or they're taking your jobs, even if they have been here for generations. You know, they're starting, a lot of immigrants start their own businesses and actually form jobs for other people. But it's the who we can target easiest. And that's a long history, not even going back to immigrants. Whether it's race or class stuff, the whole idea of race doesn't even come up until often like with Irish people and stuff. So the history of class warfare in this country, trying to get poor white Southerners to side more with rich white people against black people in the Southern plan. All this is who we can get people to align against and start separating people out. And immigrants have always been an easier target for a simple rhetoric to get people based on fear and greed. Because that's what ultimately drives democracy, fear and greed. We hate to say it, but it's the reality of it. Fear and greed are what drive democracy, because that's easy to commit to. Find me a political ad that's not really based on fear and greed. You're not going to find it. They are what drive democracy. Kind of like, capitalism is based on sin, right? We don't like to say it, but capitalism needs sin to work, because you need competition, you need jealousy, you need greed for capitalism to work. Capitalism takes this kind of Christian realist approach of, yeah, there's sin, there's greed, let's use it for good things. In pure theory communism, it's like, hey, we can all be these great people, and we can all share. It doesn't take into account that people don't like to share. People are jerks, and so ultimately it's not going to work. Capitalism kind of takes into account that, hey, let's use this. Now, pure capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism becomes problematic, because then you have all of these regulatory problems that we saw in the early 20th century, where it comes out with Upton Sinclair, the jungle, all the different mining things. So that's why you always have to have a balance of this idea of kind of, I think Niebuhr's Christian realism is always practical. Yes, we want to work towards justice, work towards God's promised day, but people are sinful, systems are sinful, businesses are sinful, politics are sinful. We need to recognize that and account for that in how we work in the world. We'll talk more about Niebuhr's realism next week in church, and throughout our series on the good Gary can do. We're going to talk about different things Niebuhr said we needed around kind of faith, hope, and love in the midst of Christian realism. So yay, Christian realism. All right, so Tuesday night, 6 o'clock, we want to come back, discuss one of the books, share your thoughts if you read it or just anything from today. It'll be much more discussion, not me talking, y'all talking amongst yourself, me just kind of hanging back, moderating, all that. So hope to see that. Yes?
Can I just ask you one question? Where were the churches during the 20s?
Same places that they always are. Some spoke out, some didn't. Some just kind of like kept their head down. And it's often a question of what's the right thing to do. Because it's not always so easy. Same thing in Nazi Germany. If you speak out, you may not just be yourself published, maybe your family, your kids, your neighbors. So is it if you make the choice to speak out and your neighbor's punished because of it, is that a good thing to do or a bad thing to do? I'm going to Czechia as part of my sabbatical, and they had this kind of resistance thing where they killed the kind of main leader of the Nazi Party in Prague. And the big question is, was that a good thing or not? Operation Anthropoid, it was called. And there was steep reprisals for that. So innocent people were killed. So you stand up and fight, but then innocent people are killed. What's the ethical thing to do? Do churches struggle with this? So there were churches that help immigrants, just like there are churches who help immigrants today, who offer sanctuary, who teach ESL classes, who offer free legal stuff. There are churches who are going out protesting. But then often, sometimes the churches who get so into that often end up stoking further polarization that also divides us even more and fragments. So you have these like really, really liberal churches, really conservative churches, and now we're looking at against each other. There's no place for people to come together, so that can often be problematic. So what's the most faithful path forward? Everybody has their own idea of that, and there's no one right answer. Charlie, then we gotta go to church.
Ultimately, the we-they problem, right? I mean, I think we tend to gather into groups for the sole purpose of defense because we're afraid, which is why they use it to drive us into allowing one voice to be the dominant voice that everyone says yes. Okay? If as soon as you put on a uniform, you're done. There's no conversation going on anymore. So there's no middle ground if you can make people go to one group or the other.
That's why it's important to try to stay in the room with difference. Have curious and courageous conversations with others. Find the common ground. Work for justice, but not in a way that demonizes people. So I find often when people have a thing they're passionate about based in faith or justice or their true beliefs, they can be so into it, they may think it's really good, but the way they do it ends up causing